Today's guest is the immediate past president of the Trinidad and Tobago Olympic Committee. So, welcome, Brian. What are some of your passions or interests outside of sports leadership?
Thank you very much, Denise, for having me on. And nice question to start off with. Most people believe that my involvement in sport is career. It's more volunteerism. I've not made a cent of my involvement in sport. All these years, it has always been voluntary. No pay, no stipends, no gratuity. Outside of sport, which is really a passion from growing up days in Belmont, my career is in insurance. I've been an insurance broker for a number of years. Started off as an agent with various companies. My first job out of school was with Horsford Printry as an office boy. And I remember when I was offered that job, they were surprised I'd taken it because, of course, you were in Fatima St. Anthony's, but it was $50 a week. I remember that. And then that was in September. And then 1st of January 1978, like a lot of young fellas at that time, I went to work in the oil field in San Fernando, Trinidad Oil Services for big dollars. The ups and downs of the oil and energy sector has always been what it is, and was retrenched and was encouraged to go into the insurance sector. And that's where I've been ever since.
So, Brian, people listening will probably be quite surprised that you've been a volunteer in sport, which means you've worked for stipends. Do you know if that has changed where people, instead of getting a stipend, are now being paid to be involved in sports?
In Trinidad and Tobago, I don't know of any significant change, but I always like to clarify, being a volunteer doesn't necessarily mean mediocrity. I would have done executive masters in governance out of an IOC scholarship out of the University of Claude Bernard in France. That there is a clear delineation in my mind between governance, which is the elected people, and management. Of course, sports are still very much kitchen table and out of cart trunks. So you have that overlap. And so that separation in people's minds, even within national sport organization, has not been made a difference between governance and management.
People can't just spend 24 hours a day being a volunteer. So I think there has to be an approach in which there's some kind of level of payment. How do you feel about that?
Trinidad is still very much recreational sport where people offer themselves for service based on their passion and commitment. They want to see whether it's road running or rugby or those sports. I think that the concept of volunteerism is going to be around for a long time in the majority of sports here in Trinidad and Tobago.
I totally agree with you that volunteerism is a very important part of it. Brian, you've been involved in TTOC, that's the Trinidad and Tobago Olympic Committee, for a number of years. What are you taking away from your involvement in those two organizations?
Denise, if I have to be very honest with you, sometimes you feel as if the more things change, the more they remain the same. There have been positives, there have been good things, but times you end up with people who assume leadership positions, have what I call dinosaur thinking, volunteer fatigue and burnout kicks in. I know some really good volunteer sports administrators who have the best interests of the country over the years. You are one of the first few persons who have asked me, why have I made a statement like that, or asked me for an explanation? Everybody else makes judgment, whether it is even the FEMA affair. So that what gets lost in those things is the why and what is the real truth. Many people who end up in leadership positions are afraid to be held to account, to be criticized, and to be unloved. Recently, one of my colleagues remained silent on a particular issue. He said, Brian, sometimes you have to make a strategic decision to stay under the tent, because if you are put out of the tent, it is very difficult to advocate for meaningful change.
What I find interesting about this remaining under the tent is that if I don't know and understand what the long term goal is, if I don't understand the why, I cannot just say, okay, let me try another strategy to remain here. So the message for me there is identify your goal. I just want to switch the conversation. What inspired you to create the Future is Female program?
The passion and the motivation that forms the basis for Future is Female, which really is about gender equity and equality. I grew up in Belmont, single parent. My mother, Jennifer Lois Nisalandi, left an abusive marriage to bring up her 4 children in Belmont. We are supported by a foster granny, Beryl Carmichael. And it wasn't easy for my mother keeping her 4 children. As she said before she died 2 years ago, her great pride and joy was, notwithstanding the environment at the time, none of her children ended up in jail. What I learned from that was the power and value that women bring. I saw my grannies, all 3 grannies, and then I had a foster granny, had to be strong, independent women, no matter the circumstances. And a lot of times they had to fight for opportunity, fight for respect. Future is Female really was a dedication to my mother. And of course, there were some practical realities that had happened besides giving women the opportunity, which is putting an all-female team together to work on the Commonwealth Youth Games 2019 bid, whether it is first ever TTOC president, first ever TTOC secretary general, first ever gender equal TTOC board, whatever. And then we have never had a female athlete win an Olympic gold medal or medal for anything. And I felt that as part of 10 Goals 2024, which wasn't pie in the sky. It started in 2015, 2024, 10 years. Every big goal you articulate as a leader, people criticize and laugh at it. I remember whether it's 10 goals, 2010 for the 2029 game, whether it's the marathon walk or the walk, the goal fund, whether it's fighting to get the anthem to be recognized by the IOC. My mother's determination instilled in us, like a lot of other mothers of the time, that whatever you believe in, you must be prepared to stand up for it and suffer the consequences. And that has always been imprinted in my mind. Stay under the tent to be able to live to fight the next day.
Brian, that has been such a wonderful sharing of the role of your mother and the ideas in her head that she communicated to you that have continued to impact what you do. If a miracle happened and you could transform sports in Trinidad and Tobago, what would you do?
The one thing, Denise, would be to change the culture of how we view sport. Why? Because you would not forget the management guru. Culture will eat strategy for breakfast every day. And no matter how much we talk about the sport industry and good governance and all of these things, as long as the culture remains where sport is seen as a pure hobby, you still have situations where people have to choose right here in Trinidad and Tobago in the year 2024. People have to choose to go to represent the country to take it out of their holidays. People still consider sport as an expenditure item and not an investment, in particular in the youth and young people. And that is one thing I'd change. If somebody came, whatever you call it, and say, I'm giving you this power and you have one thing to do, I would wave a magic wand and culture, make people see sport just as they look at law and all these things, because that's what it is.
Brian, you're talking about Peter Drucker, who talked about culture will eat strategy for breakfast. And that is such an important statement because transforming our country means changing the culture. And at the moment, sports is not seen as something that our young people should be doing on an ongoing basis. So how would you combine the education system to include participation in sports?
I've said it, people get defensive about it, but there's a need to take physical education serious, first off. It's about physical education from the perspective, just like maths and English, of physical literacy, understanding the importance of movement, basic movement, because at the end of the day, everything we have to do is move, educating people at a very early age that there's a correlation between not being physically active and non-communicable diseases. There is a correlation between the values and the discipline of participating in a sport or doing a physical activity that requires discipline, determination, teamwork that transcends day-to-day life, whether you're a lawyer. As a matter of fact, a lot of times when you interact with extremely intelligent people, bright people here in Trinidad and Tobago, they are socially awkward, nerdy. And a lot of times when you have a conversation with them, sport is not something on their radar. They have never done it. Therefore, we don't correlate social awkwardness with physical awkwardness. So I think it needs to be something in every single school and not with somebody who volunteers. It should be a pedagogical physical education trained teacher, just like they do in Jamaica and these countries with GC Foster.
So if you had to copy something from Jamaica, what would that be?
The one thing from my perspective would be physical education teachers in every school. Jamaica is a track and field country. So their whole system that we look at factory, where the sprint factory is tied into not only the physical education teacher, but their approach to track and field from even the age of 3 years. If you go to Jamaica, they're running races since then. They whole hot wired for that way. And then you have the role models now in the system who see it as a way out. I would say the physical education part. I always believe that if we could get that right meaning in every school, train physical education teacher, which will encourage people to go and study physical education and get their master's degree. It will deliver the results not just in high performance sport, but a healthier public, more socially adjusted in years. So if you did it now, the transformation is not going to happen before 10 years. And that's not something we're good with here, patient.
I was saying that years ago, one of the phrases that I made and loved is sports must become the weapon of choice. And unless we do that, nothing will change. What will happen to Trinidad and Tobago at the next Olympics?
The challenge we face is that it takes 10 to 15 years to produce an Olympic champion. If you come back to 10 gold 2020, which people say was pie in the sky, right? It had a 10-year runway. And there were things we did, whether it is the introduction of medal bonuses, the Michael Johnson high performance. The fact is, for me, it's about lessons to be learned and move forward. Maybe there are people in leadership positions who don't believe and have the confidence to set a big goal. If you look at 2028, which is in 4 years, but let's say 3 years, right? You have to have some outliers that will jump up and some miracles. If you work back 10 years and you look at what's coming through, there are challenges in the pipeline. There are two things that people have not devalued. One, the impact of COVID-19 in terms of work from home, the school system. There are a lot of young people who dropped out of the system, and sport was impacted by that quietly. The crime situation is having an impact on sports. People don't want to go into certain areas to coach, to nurture, to do anything with sports. You have borderline issues that impact the movement. People going to training at different hours. No, it's not an excuse. It means that we have to do other things more creatively and innovatively in terms of how do we capture and retain young people's interest in sports. So we have to start looking toward see what is there, provide some targeted support.
But Brian, I just wanted to add that we need to look at the systems, structures, and processes, and that will make a difference.
You're quite right. You have to then further drill it down to the communities, right? Because you have to have a process that identifies the talent. Because if you're talking about Olympics, you're talking about gold standard, right? It comes back to something we said earlier, which is in the absence of a change in the culture of how we view sport, there'll be a lot of fruitless conversations have become pragmatically real. That is why, for example, we initiative focusing on high performance to set up. It was originally 10 goal by 2024 athlete welfare and preparation fund, which transitioned to operate like a foundation to raise money and have this capital amount. We had targeted 20 million and the interest to support, because I've always said the athletes who struggle the most are the ones who getting an Olympic medal is their focus. We're not talking about those who are very talented, but they will go on a scholarship and make a life decision to build on their academic qualifications. We have to look at it's a kind of a continuum, but as I said, it's not a, and I've always told people, all the commentators, the critics, I have no problem, and I would just love to sit down to have a public conversation for hours and where we really talk about sports. It's not about who you don't agree with. To me, everybody, regardless of how vicious the criticism may be, it's important conversations that we need to have.